after my twin was beaten. For a year, he asked me to take his place. I gathered the evidence, exposed his abusers, and watched their world collapse. My identical twin brother arrived at my flat last year, looking like he had been through a battle zone. It turned out that his wife's brothers had been using him as a punching bag for almost 10 months. He requested me to trade places with him so he could get away and heal. I accepted and spent 6 weeks living his nightmare and capturing everything. Then I invited those folks to dinner and watched as their world burned. Here's how things went down. I'm James, 34, and I work as a civil engineer at a construction company in Seattle. I have a decent job, own my condo, drive a reliable truck, and live a quite simple life. My twin brother Luke and I are identical. We have the same height, build, and facial features, down to a little scar over our left forehead from a childhood bike accident. Growing up, we were constantly messing with people, swapping classes in high school and pretending to be one other at family gatherings. Our parents could tell us apart, but most others difficulty unless they knew us very well. We remained friends throughout college and adulthood, even though our career paths varied. Luke moved into marketing. He met his wife Emily at a corporate event roughly 4 years ago. We married after a whirlwind relationship. I have a 5-year-old daughter named Ella. I was the best man at his wedding. I watched him glow with happiness as he said his vows. He seemed happy with his life. Good employment, gorgeous family, and a great suburban home. That is why I was utterly unprepared for what happened on Tuesday evening in March. I was seated at my kitchen table halfway through reading drawings for a commercial project when I heard a knock. It wasn't the confident rap of a visiting friend or the snappy touch of a delivery driver. This knock was timid, almost regretful, as if the person standing on the other side wasn't sure they deserved to be there. I recall setting down my coffee mug and stepping to the door, a faint sense of anxiety gathering in my chest. When I opened the door, I didn't immediately identify the person standing there. Not because he looked different than me. We're identical twins, mirrors of each other in virtually every physical way. But the person in front of me appeared reduced, as if someone had taken my confident, accomplished brother and hollowed him out from within. His shoulders were bent forward, his head bowed. When he finally looked up at me, I noticed the bruises. These weren't the kind you get from falling over furniture or colliding with a cabinet door. They were deliberate and methodical. A dark purple bloom developed across his left cheekbone, with margins that faded into a sickly yellow-green. His bottom lip was torn and coated with dried blood that had not been thoroughly wiped. When he shifted his weight, I noted how he winced and held his ribs as if they might break open if he moved too quickly. His knuckles were rough, stripped of skin in places. He had a haunted look in his eyes that I had never seen before. Not even when we were youngsters, when things were really terrible after Mom died. This was different. This was the look of someone who had been gradually broken down over a long time. I took a step back without thinking, opening the door wider. Luke strolled by me into the apartment, like a ghost wandering through a life he no longer belonged to. I closed and locked the door behind him, then turned to face him. He stood in the center of my living room, arms wrapped around himself and looking at the floor. The stillness stretched out, oppressive and crushing, until I was finally able to whisper his name. He flinched at the sound. That brief reaction, so unlike the confident, charming brother I'd known my entire life, drove a cold rush of anxiety through me. What happened? My voice came out rougher than I wanted, piercing with stress and a hint of wrath. He did not respond right away. Instead, he slumped down onto the edge of my couch, moving slowly as if every part of him pained. He put his elbows on his knees and let his head hang forward, hands clutched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. When he finally spoke, his voice was just above a whisper, broken and wounded, and it made my chest ache. "It's Emily's brothers," he explained simply. "Ryan and Daniel." My stomach sank. I faintly recall them as loud, dominating men who dominated every family meeting, shouted over everyone, and acted as if they owned the place they occupied. Ryan was the older one, at 35, and worked in construction management. Daniel was younger, around 30, and worked in sales. Both of them exuded the aggressive assurance that comes from never being properly challenged. I had always assumed they were the type of people you tolerated because you had to, not because you wanted to. But this was something else entirely. Over the following 2 hours, Luke told me everything. His voice cracked and his hands shook as he recounted the events of the previous year. "It started small," he said. "A nudge here, A harsh comment there, usually disguised as physical play between men and disregarded as brotherly fun. They made fun of him at family dinners, insulted his work and marketing, and referred to him as wimpy, weak, and not macho enough for their sister. Emily would occasionally laugh along, or worse, say nothing at all and simply look away as they tore him apart piece by piece. Luke felt he could handle it. He assumed if he kept his head down, stayed quiet, and proven himself, they'd finally leave him alone. But things grew worse. They began arriving at the house unannounced, barging in as if they owned the place, stealing food from the fridge, changing the channels on the television, and making it apparent that Luke had no voice in his own home. When Emily wasn't around, they'd keep an eye on him, testing his limits and pushing him harder. Ryan threw Luke into a wall around 7 months ago after politely asking them to leave since Ella was attempting to sleep upstairs. Luke tried to stand his ground and set some basic boundaries. That's when the first serious beating occurred. They confronted him in the garage one Saturday afternoon, telling him he was embarrassing the family and that he needed to learn his place. Daniel held him while Ryan punched him methodically and coldly, as if he were teaching him a lesson rather than losing his cool. They urged him not to tell anyone, particularly Emily. They claimed no one would trust him anyway, and if he tried to cause a problem, they'd make certain he lost everything: his marriage, daughter, and reputation. They'd describe him as erratic, violent, and a liar. Luke felt they could do it because they were Emily's brothers, and the family had always rallied around them. He'd seen Emily's parents, John and Linda, adore Ryan and Daniel, as if they couldn't do anything wrong. So he remained mute. Despite the injuries, threats, and humiliation, he struggled to survive. The beatings became increasingly regular. Ryan would show up while Emily was at work, force his way inside, and use Luke as a punching bag for whatever frustration he was experiencing that day. Daniel would occasionally join in, pinning Luke down as Ryan worked him over. They were careful, generally taking body pictures that could be covered beneath clothing, with occasional facial injuries that Luke explained away as workplace accidents or clumsiness around the house. Emily saw the bruises but accepted his answers without inquiry. Perhaps she did not want to face the truth. Perhaps she was intentionally blind to what her brothers were doing. In any case, she never pushed, demanded actual answers, or prioritized her husband's safety over her family's tranquility. The saddest part, Luke explained, was how they exploited Ella as leverage. They'd make veiled threats about what might happen to a little girl if her father wasn't attentive. They'd chat about custody disputes, how judges always favored the mother, and how easy it would be to portray Luke as an inadequate parent. Those threats kept him immobile, stuck in a nightmare he couldn't awaken from. "I'm afraid all the time," he acknowledged, his voice breaking. "I'm afraid they'll escalate and hurt Ella. I'm afraid Emily will choose them over me if I force her to select a side. I feel like I'm drowning, and I don't see a way out." That's when he looked up at me, eyes red-rimmed and distraught, and asked if I could help him. Not in some vague future fashion. He needed assistance immediately. He stated he wanted to vanish for a while to regroup, breathe, and decide what to do next. But he couldn't simply leave. Ryan and Daniel would go after him, or worse, they would vent their wrath on Ella. He needed someone to take his position. Just for a brief while, just enough to buy him some time. And because we were twins, had spent our whole lives being mistaken for each other, and no one outside our immediate family could tell us apart until they peered closely, he thought I might be able to pull it off. He was asking me to become him, to enter his life, wear his face, and endure everything he'd been through while he hid somewhere secure and tried to heal. I should have said no. A sensible individual would have. The plan was absurd, risky, and legally problematic at best, but I refused to say no. I saw how broken my brother, my twin, my other half, the guy with whom I shared a womb and who understood me better than anybody else in the world, was. I could see the injuries, anxiety, and tiredness written all over his face. I couldn't allow him return to that place alone. I couldn't allow those men keep abusing him and grinding him down until nothing remained. So I answered, yes. I promised him I'd do it. I would switch places with him, enter his life, confront his tormentors, and give him the time he needed to flee. More importantly, I resolved to hold Ryan and Daniel accountable for their actions. I wouldn't merely survive in his position. I would set a trap. I would gather proof, expose their harshness, and undermine their authority over him. I would teach them something they would never forget. We spent the following 3 days preparing every aspect with military precision. I temporarily moved into Luke's apartment as we prepped, utilizing my condo as a staging space for the necessary equipment and papers. Luke talked me through every element of his everyday routine, from how he tied his shoes to the exact route he took to work, avoiding certain streets that added stress to his morning. He showed me his workplace workstation through images and movies he'd secretly captured on his phone. I memorized the names of his co-workers. David, who sat in the adjacent cubicle and constantly wanted to speak about sports, and Sarah from accounting, who brought in handmade cookies each Friday. His supervisor, Laura, had excessive expectations for turnaround times. I learned about his ongoing marketing activities, got to know the clients he worked with, and studied the industry lingo he employed on a daily basis. The evenings were spent understanding his family life. Luke showed footage of Ella at supper while she was getting ready for bed. I observed how he interacted with her, the specific voices he used when reading different characters in her storybooks, the way he counted down from 5 when she was delaying bedtime, and how he celebrated when she drew a new picture. Ella was recently intrigued with dinosaurs, particularly velociraptors, and she enjoyed creating detailed depictions of them in jungles. She always carried a stuffed triceratops named Mr. Stompy with her. Emily was more complicated. Luke explained how she enjoyed her coffee. 2 sugars, a splash of cream, served in the blue mug she had received from her parents. She worked as a billing coordinator for a downtown medical office. Usually left the house by 7:30 and returned around 5:15. She disliked discussing work at home, preferred reality TV shows in the evenings, and had developed the habit of scrolling through social media on her phone rather than engaging in real conversation. She wasn't always like this, Luke explained quietly one night. When we first got married, we'd talk for hours, make plans, and dream about the future. But somewhere along the way, she started pulling back. I think it was when her brothers started coming around more frequently, and she chose them over me, piece by piece, until there wasn't much of us left. Emily prioritized her brother's opinions over Luke's feelings, dismissing his concerns about their intrusive behavior, making jokes at his expense when they mocked him, treating it as harmless sibling teasing instead of the systematic undermining it was. He explained that the marriage had been deteriorating for at least 1.5 years, with small moments of disconnection adding up over time. Most importantly, Luke walked me through the dynamics with Ryan and Daniel in painful detail. Ryan usually arrived on Wednesday evenings, or Thursday afternoons if he'd taken the day off work, and he'd let himself in without knocking, using the key Emily had given him during their first year of marriage. Ryan would do food, commenting on the state of the house, and asking intrusive questions about their finances or marriage. The physical intimidation would begin subtly, with Ryan standing too close to Luke, backing him into corners during conversation, and touching him aggressively disguised as friendly pats on the shoulder that were actually just hard enough to hurt. Immediately established dominance by helping himself. If Emily wasn't home, Ryan would lash out at Luke, shoving him against walls, grabbing his shirt collar, and getting right in his face, all while making threats about what would happen if he ever complained to Emily about their visits. Daniel, on the other hand, took a more measured approach. Daniel would show up on weekends, usually Saturday mornings when Emily took Ella to her parents' house for a few hours. He'd bring takeout, act friendly at first, then gradually shift into interrogation mode, asking about Luke's job performance, salary, retirement plans, and adequacy as a husband and father. Each question was designed to undermine and diminish. Daniel's the one who first threatened Ella, Luke told me, his voice shaking with the memory. He said it casually, as if he were commenting on the weather, just mentioning how easy it would be for a child to have an accident, how tragic it would be if something happened to her because her father couldn't protect her properly. He smiled as he said it. James smiled, as if he enjoyed watching me realize how powerless I was. Both brothers had keys, both felt entitled to show up whenever they wanted, and both had made it clear that if Luke ever told Emily the full extent of what was going on, he would lose everything. They'd already talked about their strategy, how they'd claim Luke was mentally unstable, how they'd present his inevitable defensive injuries as evidence he was violent, and how they'd paint themselves as concerned brothers trying to protect their sister from an abusive husband. It was a calculated campaign of terror, and they'd been getting away with it because Luke was paralyzed by fear of losing Ella, and no one in Emily's family would believe him over her brothers. I set up. I bought a small audio recorder that looked like a pen and kept it in my shirt pocket whenever I was at home. The devices were designed to look like everyday objects, such as a clock on the mantle, a phone charger on the kitchen counter, and a smoke detector in the hallway, and they all recorded continuously to cloud storage that only I had access to. The bruises Luke already had, his account of previous incidents, and copies of medical records from an ER visit where he claimed to have fallen downstairs. On the 4th day we made the switch. Luke cut his hair to match the slightly longer style I'd been wearing, and we swapped clothes, wallets, phones, and keys. I drove him to a remote cabin I'd rented 2.5 hours north of Seattle, helped him settle in with groceries and supplies for an extended stay, paid for with cash, off the grid enough for him to decompress without constantly looking over his shoulder, and told him to stay here as we stood in the cabin's small living room. I'll handle Ryan and Daniel. I'll document everything they do, and when I have enough evidence, we'll legally destroy them. Luke looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Gratitude mixed with guilt, mixed with something like hope. I don't know how to thank you for this. You don't need to thank me because you're my brother. I drove back to Seattle that afternoon and moved into Luke's house. Emily was at work, Ella was at daycare, and I walked through the rooms, familiarizing myself with the space, the layout, and the small details that would help me sell the illusion. There were family photos on the walls, and Ella's artwork was magnetized to the refrigerator. Emily's reading glasses were on the coffee table, and I was in the kitchen preparing spaghetti with meat sauce, one of Luke's standard weeknight meals. I'd practiced his body language in the mirror, the slightly hunched shoulders, the way he'd learned to make himself smaller, less threatening, less noticeable. "Hey," I said as she walked in, keeping my voice level and neutral. "Hey," she replied, barely looking at me as she sat down her purse and helped Ella out of her jacket. Traffic was awful. "Ella, go wash your hands for dinner." The 5-year-old bounded off to the bathroom and Emily moved through the kitchen with the practiced efficiency of someone going through familiar motions. I read Ella her bedtime story, a book about a velociraptor who wanted to be a ballerina, doing the voices for all the dinosaurs exactly as Luke had taught me. Ella giggled at the T-Rex's silly dance moves and hugged Mr. Stompy tightly when I tucked her in. She didn't seem to notice anything different about me, and why would she? I was doing an excellent job of being Luke, the beaten-down, careful version he'd become. Emily watched TV in the living room while I cleaned the kitchen, methodically wiping down counters and loading the dishwasher the way Luke said he did every night. She looked up at me with complete trust, and the weight of what I was doing hit me hard. This little girl was relying on her father to protect her, and I had to keep the illusion perfect to keep her safe. She barely acknowledged me, engrossed in some reality show about wealthy housewives fighting over catering drama, and we went to bed without much conversation. I slept in the guest room, claiming I had a cold and didn't want to make her sick, an excuse Luke had suggested, knowing Emily had a thing about germs and would welcome the separation without question. After Emily fell asleep, I'd go over the day's recordings, take detailed notes, and back everything up to multiple cloud storage locations. I made a spreadsheet that tracked every incident, threat, and moment that could be used as evidence, with dates, times, people present, exact words spoken, physical actions taken, all documented with the precision I normally used for engineering projects. Ryan arrived on Wednesday evening, right on time. I was home from work around 6 p.m., heating up leftovers in the microwave, when I heard his key in the lock. He walked in like he owned the place, didn't knock or announce himself, just strode into the kitchen and grabbed a soda from the refrigerator without asking. "Hey there, champ," he said with the condescending tone Luke warned me about. Ryan was a big guy, about 6'1" and probably 210 pounds. All of it comes from lifting weights at the gym rather than developing functional strength. He exuded the confidence of someone who had never been seriously challenged, who had spent his entire life getting away with bullying because he was bigger and louder than everyone else. A difficult day at work pushing papers. I kept my gaze down, assuming the role Luke had played for over a year. It was just a long day with many meetings. Yes, meetings. Ryan laughed as if it were the funniest thing he'd heard that day. It must be difficult to sit in conference rooms discussing marketing strategies while real men are doing actual work. My crew poured the foundation for a 3-story office building today. Built something real, something that will last. The implication was clear. Luke's career was meaningless. His work was useless. He was less of a man because he did not engage in physical labor. It was the same pattern Luke had described. Ryan's script for establishing dominance and making his brother-in-law feel inferior. I did not respond, instead focusing on my plate of reheated casserole. Ryan circled the kitchen island and crowded me against the counter. "This was how it always began," Luke explained. "Small provocations are intended to push boundaries and reinforce the power dynamic." "Emily working late again?" Ryan inquired, his tone implying that he already knew the answer. "She'll get home around 7. Good. Good. You don't want her to see her husband as such a pathetic loser, right?" He shoved my shoulder. Not hard enough to cause injury, but aggressive enough to be intimidating. "You are embarrassing her. You understand that my sister deserves better than some wimpy marketing nerd who cannot stand up for himself. She could have married anyone, but she chose you." The recorder in my pocket was recording every phrase with excellent clarity. The camera, disguised as a kitchen clock, was recording footage in high definition, capturing Ryan's aggressive posture, entering my personal space and placing his hand on my shoulder. I allowed him to continue his routine, absorbing the insults and responding with the subservient body language he expected. Hunched shoulders, downcast eyes, and brief verbal responses that would not elicit additional anger. Ryan spent around 20 minutes establishing his supremacy. He criticized everything. The cleanliness of the kitchen, the food I was eating, my work attire, my posture, and my overall presence. Every insult was intended to undermine Luke's self-esteem, to reinforce the notion that he was useless and should be lucky Ryan and Daniel tolerated him at all. When Emily's car arrived into the driveway, Ryan's tone changed instantaneously. He became polite and cheerful, the concerned brother simply checking in on his sister's family. He ruffled my hair in what appeared to be a loving gesture to an outsider, but was actually another display of domination, treating me like a child who required his approval. "Good talk, champ," he remarked loudly enough for Emily to hear as she stepped through the door. "Just making sure my sister is being properly cared for. Families are supposed to look out for each other, right?" Emily smiled at him, oblivious to or purposefully disregarding what had just happened. "Thanks for checking in, Ryan. Want to stay for dinner?" "Nah, got plans, but I'll see you this weekend at Mom and Dad's." He gave me a warning look as he left, a silent reminder to keep my mouth shut about everything that had just happened. After he left, I sat at the dinner table with Emily and Ella, playing the role of the subdued, beaten-down husband and father, while internally cataloging everything for the inevitable confrontation. Ella talked about her day at daycare, finger painting, and a friend who had brought in cookies for everyone. I listened and responded appropriately, maintaining the illusion while the recorder in my pocket continued to record every moment of my transformed life. That night, after Emily and Ella had fallen asleep, I reviewed the footage and audio, and it was flawless. Ryan showed up twice a week, sometimes alone, sometimes with Daniel, and I added it to my growing evidence file, organizing everything chronologically and creating a narrative that could not be denied or dismissed. They'd let themselves in, tease me, push me around, and occasionally escalate to actual violence. I documented everything, every insult, shove, and punch, and the cameras caught it all in high definition. Daniel was different from Ryan. He was less openly hostile, but more calculated. The physical violence escalated around week 4 when Ryan showed up angry at work and took it out on me in the garage. He'd make threats about Ella, talk about how easy it would be to prove I was an unfit father, and describe in detail what could happen in a custody battle. The recordings were especially damning, revealing premeditation and psychological abuse. Daniel held my arms while Ryan worked me over, mostly with body shots and a few hits to the face that I couldn't block. I let it happen, gritting my teeth and focusing on the recorder in my pocket and the camera I'd hidden in the garage ceiling. Emily noticed the new bruises that night, and I was in the bathroom assessing the damage when she walked in. For a moment, I thought she might finally ask the right questions, choose to see what was going on, but instead she just sighed and said, "You need to be more careful." That response told me everything I needed to know about her complicity. She wasn't actively participating in the abuse, but she was enabling it through willful blindness. Ryan and Daniel had assaulted me 7 times, made countless threats, and demonstrated a clear pattern of sustained abuse. By week 6, I had dozens of hours of footage and audio recordings, enough evidence to bury them legally. All I had to do now was spring the trap. I meticulously organized it. Emily's parents were celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary, and the entire family was meeting for dinner at their house. It was the ideal opportunity, everyone in one place, no way for Ryan and Daniel to avoid the confrontation, and maximum exposure for their misdeeds. During our nightly phone check-in, I told Luke about my plan. He was hesitant at first, concerned about the possibility of violence, but I persuaded him that this was the safest option. Public exposure with witnesses, documentation ready to hand over to authorities. The night before the anniversary dinner, I prepared everything, editing the most damning footage into a compilation video, organizing the audio recordings chronologically, compiling hospital records and photographs of injuries. Ryan and Daniel were already holding court in the living room, telling some story that had everyone laughing. When they saw me walk in, Ryan smirked and made some comment about me actually showing up for once, and Daniel muttered something to his friend that made them both laugh. They had no idea what was coming. Dinner was the usual family affair. There was too much food, too many conversations going on at the same time, John telling stories about his early marriage while Linda beamed beside him, and I played my role perfectly, staying quiet, keeping my head down, being the diminished version of Luke they all expected. After dessert, John stood up to thank everyone for coming, and I stood up as well. "I'd like to say something as well," I announced, keeping my voice calm about family and what it means to defend the ones you love. The crowd grew quiet, bewildered. This wasn't part of the program. Emily gave me a warning glance, evidently uncomfortable with me garnering attention. Ryan and Daniel exchanged glances, probably thinking I was about to embarrass myself in some way. I pulled out a small remote control and pointed it at the TV mounted on the dining room wall. I'd arranged with John earlier to set up a laptop connection, claiming I wanted to show family photos, and he'd agreed without question. For the past 6 weeks I'd continued as the screen flickered to life. "I've been documenting something that's been happening in this family, something that everyone here needs to see." The first video began playing, Ryan entering Luke's house uninvited and immediately beginning his verbal assault. The audio was crystal clear, and every insult and threat was perfectly captured. The room went completely silent as people watched. Linda gasped, John's face turned red, Emily paled, Ryan began to stand. But his father yelled at him to sit down and watch, and the compilation continued. 6 weeks of abuse condensed into a devastating 12-minute presentation, Ryan pushing me against walls, Daniel holding me while Ryan threw punches. Both of them made explicit threats about Ella, about wrecking Luke's life if he ever spoke up. The film was indisputable, time-stamped, and clearly showed faces. Some of the women in the room began crying, and John appeared to have a heart attack. Ryan and Daniel sat frozen, their faces cycling through shock, anger, and finally fear as they realized the magnitude of what they were watching. When the video ended, the silence was deafening. I stood in front of 35 witnesses and said, "Ryan and Daniel have been systematically abusing Luke for more than a year. They've battered him, threatened him, tortured his daughter, and converted his house into a prison. And everyone in this family, everyone allowed it to happen." Ryan surged out of his chair, his face twisted with wrath. "You cannot. This is taken out of context." "Context?" I repeated calmly. "Please explain the context in which it is okay to beat your sister's husband and threaten a 4-year-old child." Daniel tried a different approach, turning to his parents with desperation. "Dad, this is absurd. He's making it up somehow. We were merely—" "Just what?" I interrupted. "Just tormenting someone for a year. Just committing several laws, including assault, violence, terroristic threats, and criminal trespass. All of this has been videotaped and reported to the police." At this point, I unveiled the second part of my plan. 2 uniformed officers entered through the front entrance. I had phoned them earlier, outlined the scenario, and offered preliminary evidence. They had agreed to stand by during the dinner, waiting for my signal. The cops approached Ryan and Daniel, informed them that they were being arrested for assault, battery, criminal threats, and harassment. Ryan began yelling about lawyers and false accusations. Daniel went pale and silent. Their parents watched in horror. Friends and extended family stood frozen. Emily sobbed in the corner. And as they were released, Ryan turned to me with pure hatred in his eyes and said, "You're going to regret this. We will destroy you in court. We will take everything." I looked at him calmly and said, "You've attempted to destroy someone for over a year. You attempted to break him to make him feel powerless and worthless, but I'm no longer your victim." Ryan's face went blank with astonishment as he heard that final comment. But before he could understand it, the officers dragged him to the door. Both brothers were thrown into cop cars and driven away, and the house became much quieter, with only the subtle sound of Linda crying and others shifting uncomfortably. I turned to the remaining guests. "I believe it is time for everyone to leave. If anyone wants copies of the proof to help them grasp what has happened, I can send them. Otherwise, please go." Most people couldn't leave fast enough, offering awkward condolences or apologies or just fleeing in shock. Linda approached me before she left, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry," she said, voice breaking. "I didn't know. I had no idea they were doing this." I glanced at her and saw genuine terror in her eyes. "Maybe you didn't realize the extent of it," I said. "But there were signs. There were times when you could have asked inquiries. You may have puzzled why your son-in-law appeared to be increasingly terrified and beaten down. The signs were there. Everyone decided not to see them." She nodded, crying more, and walked away with John, who had yet to speak. Emily sat on the couch, her face blotchy from crying, and looked up at me with something resembling fury. "How could you do this to my family?" she inquired, her voice quivering. "We're going to lose everything because of you." I sat across from her, suddenly fatigued as the adrenaline that had kept me going began to wear off. "Emily, your brothers have been hitting your husband for over a year. They terrified your daughter. They transformed your house into a haven of dread and violence, and you allowed them. You made things easier for them. You prioritized their approval over your family's safety. This did not happen because of me. This happened as a result of choices you and your brothers made repeatedly." She shook her head, still in denial. "But they were just being protective, making sure you were treating me well." I let out a bitter laugh. "Protecting you from what? From a husband who adored you and wished to create a life with you. Emily, they weren't defending you. They were controlling you and abusing him, and you let them because it was easier than standing up to them." I stood up and told her that divorce papers would be filed within a week, that Luke would be seeking sole custody of Ella, and that she should hire a lawyer. She looked at me in confusion, about to ask something, when I decided to tell her the truth. "I'm not your spouse," I clarified. "I'm his twin brother, James. Luke came to me 6 weeks ago, bruised, afraid, and broken. He urged me to trade places with him so he could escape and heal. So I came into his life and took his position. I've been living here, absorbing the abuse he was taking, documenting everything, and constructing a case to destroy the men who were destroying him." I watched her face cycle between uncertainty, disbelief, shock, and eventually comprehension. "You are his brother. This whole time, everything you've been doing to Luke for the past 6 weeks, you've been doing to me," I said. "Every blow, every insult, every moment of cruelty, I took it for him, and I videotaped it all. Your husband is safe, away from you and your brothers. He's been healing, and I've been gathering evidence to ensure Ryan and Daniel face the consequences of their actions." She looked at me for a long time, and I noticed something shatter behind her eyes. I went upstairs to the guest room I'd been using, closed the door behind me, and shut it out. She put her face in her hands and sobbed, and I felt no sympathy. I told her I'd be staying in the house that night, but she should probably go to her parents' place. I had exposed them, sprung the trap, and they had stepped straight into it. Everything else would follow from here. The legal proceedings, the penalties, the rebuilding. I took out my phone and dialed Luke at the cabin. He answered on the first ring, his voice taut with tension. I told him everything about the dinner, the evidence, the reactions, Ryan and Daniel's arrest, Emily's complicity being exposed, and how it was finally over. He remained silent for a long time. Then I heard him cry, great gasping sobs of relief and release. "Thank you," he said when he could speak again. "I don't know how to thank you enough." "You don't need to thank me," I informed him. "You are my brother. I would gladly do it again. Now stay at the cabin for a few more days till things settle. Then you can return to your new apartment." I'd previously helped him find a 1-bedroom apartment across town, away from Emily and her family. A fresh start where he could rebuild his life and provide a safe setting for Ella during custody visits. We talked for a while longer, both of us exhausted and relieved, and still struggling to believe it was all over. After we hung up, I just sat there in the quiet room, feeling the bruises ache, the exhaustion settle into my bones, and I let myself breathe. The legal aftermath unfolded over the next several months. Ryan and Daniel were both charged with multiple felonies, including assault in the 2nd degree, criminal threats, stalking, and harassment. Rather than risk a trial, both agreed to plea bargains. Ryan was sentenced to 16 months in county jail and 2 years probation, while Daniel was sentenced to 12 months in probation. Both were ordered to have no contact with Luke or Ella indefinitely, and Luke's divorce from Emily was finalized 3 months later. Emily's parents, John and Linda, actually reached out to Luke after the judge reviewed all of the evidence and made it clear that Luke was the stable, protective parent. Luke was granted sole physical custody of Ella, with Emily having supervised visitation rights. The judge was appalled at how Emily had enabled the abuse and made it clear in his ruling that Luke was the stable, protective parent. They apologized profusely, said they were ashamed of their sons and their own blindness, and expressed a desire to maintain a relationship with Ella if Luke would allow it. He agreed to supervised visits, recognizing they were Ella's grandparents, and they appeared genuinely sorry. As for me, I returned to my condo and my normal life. The bruises healed and the stiffness went away, but the experience altered me in ways I'm still processing. I now have a better grasp of what it means to be truly vulnerable, to be stuck in a situation when calling for help appears impossible.